The government was celebrating rising GST collections year after year.
That's right.
1 lakh crores, 1.5 lakh crores. I mean, you're actually hitting the poor with a very anti-poor form of taxation.
Prime Minister Modi talks about cooperative federalism, and you still think GST...
And does what? Cooperative federalism is a mantra Modi has been uttering. I agree. I know that he's been saying this. He's a master of mantras. But I'll wait till I say it. I'd be very surprised if Nirmala Sitharaman opted for equity.
Hello and welcome. I'm Vijay Srinivas, and as India marks 8 years since the implementation of the GST, so we're joined by Dr. Venkatesh Athreya, economist here in Chennai, to discuss more on what the GST has to offer and what the GST has offered in the last 8 years. Thank you very much for joining us on TheFederal. The first question I would like to begin with, one of the biggest criticisms of the GST has been it's been too complex. The very idea of GST is to simplify India's tax system, right? I mean, but we still see way too many slabs and exemptions and frequent rate changes, kind of puzzling the taxpayers as well. So has GST failed to deliver what it actually promised 8 years back?
It all depends on who you're looking at when you say has it delivered or not. Mm-hmm. I would say, in fact, it has delivered a body blow to the poor. It's an atrocious taxation form. It's an indirect tax. There are two things that are fundamentally, seriously to be questioned about it. One, that it destroys the relative autonomy of state governments to decide on tax rates. First of all, the direct tax rates are in the hands of the Government of India. So state governments can only, by and large, impose indirect taxes, taxes on commodities, goods and services. And these are elected state governments. They have a certain sovereignty, partial sovereignty, not national sovereignty, but in the territory where they've been elected. But although these people are elected, under the GST, they have no power to tax commodities. Everything has to go to the GST Council, which is dominated by the union government. So fundamentally, GST is against the autonomy of states. It's a centralizing measure. And this is what the big corporate sector wanted. They wanted India as a single market. They wanted to fix rules for the entire country. They don't recognize state governments. They don't recognize elected state governments. Government means Government of India. So first, it's a severe attack on state autonomy, number one. Remember, this is actually, if you go back to the time when the GST was brought in as law, there's a whole stupid spectacle, ridiculous spectacle, I would say, of treating this as a second freedom day. You have June 30th, 2004. 17 was it, and Parliament, and
that's then right, yeah.
You have celebrating this as some kind of a new dawn. Especially from a party which wanted one country, one language, one country, one tax, one country, one religion. Suddenly you have GST, which is not one country, one tax. Okay, that's the other point you're making, that there are multiple rates and they're being changed and all that. Second point I want to make is, apart from the destruction of the autonomy of state governments, weakening of their financial power, and centralizing the power of taxation in the hands of the Government of India, fundamentally it is an indirect tax. It is a tax not based on the ability to pay. So the rich and the poor pay the same rate of tax on all goods and services. This again is a very unequal, content in terms of the principles underlying it. Normally in any tax system, especially in a poorer country like ours, you would want the rich to pay their fair share of the development burden. So the rich should be taxed higher. This is what income tax purports to do. In our country, of course, the rich have been very powerful politically. So they managed to, first of all, they managed to structure taxation even of direct taxes, income and corporate income tax and personal income tax, in such a way that the rich are relatively shielded by all kinds of exemptions of various kinds. But at least there is some element of equity. The rich pay more, the poor pay less. In the indirect tax of the GST kind, there is no such thing. I mean, so today, if you take the combined revenues, tax revenues of the union government and all the state governments, the share of indirect taxes, that is taxes not based on the ability to pay, but flat across income groups is actually something like 65%, or nearly 2/3. Only about a third of the total tax revenue comes from direct taxes, which are ostensibly based on the ability to pay income tax, personal income tax and corporate income tax. There also, if you look at the trends over a period of time, and there used to be a very good publication called Indian Public Finance Statistics, an annual series. It disappeared around 2020. I have not seen a copy since. I once asked one of the finance secretaries of one of the state governments. He said he would, when he goes to Delhi, he would look into it. Nothing much has happened. So there, what's happened is that there used to be a very detailed picture year after year. And the broad picture remains not enormously different across time, but basically one that favors the rich and hurts the poor in terms of structural taxation. The other point I was making to you was that this weakens the decision-making domain of the state governments, because they can no longer tax. There are only 4 commodities they can tax. In addition to just falling in line with GST for the country as a whole, they can tax petrol, diesel,
alcohol,
and tobacco. And today you have an article in the Hindu saying why tobacco rates should be raised. From a health point of view, I have a lot of sympathy with that argument. But so the narrative that you began with is a narrative that I reject. But this is the corporate narrative. They want simple taxes, they want lower rates, they want, of course they wouldn't mind exemptions for themselves. That's a different matter altogether. So I'm not a great fan of the GST, but during the COVID, if you go back and look at it, the government was celebrating rising GST collections year after year.
That's right.
1 lakh crores, 1.5 lakh crores. I mean, you're actually hitting the poor with a very, anti-poor form of taxation. You're celebrating more tax revenues from it.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask you that. So, apparently I had the opportunity to interview Tamil Nadu's then finance minister a couple of years back, Mr. PTR.
Yes.
And he too had actually said, this taxation will actually keep going higher and higher again. And that's something that's not just been the, the view as far as the central finance ministry is concerned, but that's what the states also really think, I mean, and the revenue collections are now stronger than ever. We had the PIB press release stating that gross GST collections doubled in 5 years to hit record 22 lakh crore in FY25. You still think that these kind of successes are sort of covering up the deeper issues, uneven state level compliance and other enforcement gaps and so on?
No, those are also there, but this is basically a very anti-poor attitude. If you celebrate doubling of GST revenue, you're not asking what happened to direct tax collections. See, what proportion of the GDP of this country do direct taxes amount to? I have a figure, not just for direct taxes, the total
3 to 4% you say.
Tax burden for the entire country, if you add both direct and indirect taxes, it's hardly exceeded 14, 15, 16% of GDP. And this is a very low rate of taxation in a country where a very small proportion of the population account for a large part of the wealth. 1% at the top account for 42% of the wealth in this country, and around the same proportion of income. And they are hardly taxed. There are all sorts of exemptions are there to help them. And then in the name of encouraging investment, in the name of easy business and so on, so many concessions are offered to them. And my point is not that you should tax the corporate sector punitively, but before you can even touch them, they're screaming. And because of the power with government, and because of course they provide the money for the elections, so to be pretty straightforward about it. If you look at the whole electoral bond fiasco, who gave the money and to whom. I don't need to elaborate this. These are things not discussed in polite circles, you see, but this must be discussed, matter of truth. So the taxation system in this country, especially post GST, has been even more anti-poor. It was always anti-poor, but even more so now. And because the whole narrative now is lower the tax rates, surpluses will come, that the corporates will invest, country will grow. The question to ask is, have they invested? What has been the rates of investment? Despite all the concessions given to them, what have been the rate of investment? So when you judge GST, you should judge it comprehensively. Yes, 1 year you may get GST revenues rising. Is that the sole metric of success? That I got 22 lakh crores this year as compared to 11 lakh crores a few years ago. Is that the metric of success? Who did you get it from?
Absolutely, 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, do we get from 1.4 billion people or mostly from the poorer sections? Yeah, exactly. So, what are you doing about direct taxes? What about corporate tax rates? What about personal income tax rates? What are the kinds of exemptions being offered? In fact, if anything, personal income tax rates have not been so kind to the taxpayers. Somewhat middle class and better off. The corporate tax rates, on the other hand, have been slashed left, right, and center over a period. And this is beside the exemptions they can claim. So if you look at the tax laws, and you keep saying simplify tax laws and make it transparent and all that, some efforts have been taken. I'm not saying no. But on the whole, our tax system is skewed very strongly in favor of the well-to-do. Okay, let me give you one striking example to think about. We had a wealth tax in this country for a long time. Then somewhere in the 80s, R. Venkataraman, I think, removed it, 81 or so. He was a finance minister that time before he became president. Then later on, Pranab Mukherjee brought it back. But then Arun Jaitley said, what do you want to have a wealth tax? So in 2017, they removed the wealth tax. So what was the argument? Oh, we can't collect it, there's so little, it's not worth collecting. Which means that if the rich don't pay taxes, you don't ask them why you're not paying taxes. You say, okay, you can't pay taxes, very good, then we'll also remove the tax. What is this? I mean, this is, the brazenness of the whole process strikes me as very reflective of the interests of the elite in this country. They don't question these things from a moral viewpoint. It's not like if you tax Tata's 1% more, they're going to come crashing down. No, I think there is enough room for better, more effective taxation, direct taxation, taxation of income and wealth based on the ability to pay. And in place of greater reliance on GST, should actually be relying more on direct taxes. Yes, it's a poor country, so you can't rely only on direct taxes. You'll have to have indirect taxes. I understand. No, I'm not saying you can't have indirect tax at all, but I'm saying indirect taxes can be more moderate, and there can also be rate differences across items. So luxury items will be taxed at a higher rate. Remember when this was proposed, many corporates said, this complicates the tax system. We'll have one rate, one country, one rate. I make a joke. One country, one rate, one country, one language, one country, one religion, one country, one bathroom. What is this nonsense? India is a diverse country. Conditions of each state differs. So in each state, the state government must have some. After all, don't forget that the state governments are elected. They are not appointed from Delhi, mercifully. So if they are elected state government, they owe it to the people to deliver on the promises they have made to them. So in fact, I think that the balance must shift in favor of greater power of taxation for the state governments and not centralizing all taxation powers at the union level. Because already in our constitutional scheme of things, state governments have no power to tax incomes. At best, local bodies can do property taxes and so on, or registration, stamp duty. These are the few things that you can do. But if we can actually redress this imbalance, this big fiscal imbalance, which is why states have a lot of responsibilities, but far less revenue. Central has far less responsibility, but far greater revenue. This is why every finance commission provides what is called the revenue deficit grant to states, because it recognizes that states have a much larger agenda of expenditure. So I think keeping all those things in mind, we should, re-examine the whole GST system.
Okay.
And move towards a more rational system. Some tweaking, but all the tweaking, as someone you had said, is just to raise revenue, right? They keep raising revenue, so they celebrate this 11 to 20 lakh crore rupees. There is room for changes. There is room for modification of GST, particularly by having 2 or 3 rates is all right, and the luxury goods must be taxed far more effectively. But in a poor country, you say Beti Bachao, and then you charge for sanitary napkins 18%. Now it's reduced.
Now it's come down 5%.
Yeah, but remember, all these absurdities were there. And all because the government bureaucrats at that level serving their masters are driven by the need to raise revenues. They're not looking at the social implications of the
That's
taxation. The political leadership should look at it. But this political leadership in India for the last 10 years has been more concerned with, religion and things of the kind, not so much the economy and its benefits. Yeah.
So, I mean, GST by nature is a destination-based tax, right? I
Right.
mean, and how do you see it impacting the manufacturing powerhouses like Tamil Nadu and
Yeah.
Maharashtra? Because do you think there should have been some kind of equitable sort of approach to balance producing and consuming goods?
Yeah, the original argument was that GST benefits the consuming states. And so states like Kerala, in fact, bought into this
That's right.
and accepted GST. It doesn't quite work like that because there's now much more complex circuits in the country. And as integration grows, that will grow even more complex. It's difficult to make a general observation on this, but I would say if you're going to have a GST regime, make it moderate, don't tinker with it too much, and have a clear demarcation between luxury goods and services and others. It's still true that many transactions don't come into your net. I mean, unorganized, non-billed transactions don't come in. But even it's not going to be possible in a country like India to catch everything, right? So, yes, I think the producing consuming states argument by itself alone cannot solve the issue. I mean, it's true when you place states like Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, which do a lot of manufacturing.
That's right.
Do feel that they are, not fairly treated by the GST scheme of things. I'm less concerned about such issues, more concerned about overall equity in the population and across states. State autonomy is an important issue. Even in a country like the US, which is, much more neoliberal and all that.
It's a lot of state-centric.
States have autonomy
That's
in
right.
fixing rates and all that.
Centers have got no leverage over.
Much less.
Yeah, that's right.
Even China, which of course you see as the most authoritarian, kind of monster in the world, which is what the corporate press likes to see it as, there's a lot of decentralization. States make their own decisions. So that's a larger constitutional question that we need to restructure center-state relations in a way that states have more power because they have the bulk of spending to do and they are right there. You see, when something goes wrong, the union hardly gets blamed. People only attack the nearest government, which is the state government. So I think, yes, GST, a modified GST regime, which restores some of the powers of taxation of the states and which opts for a lower rate, more stable system. And more fundamentally, if the overall taxation system is tweaked in a way that wealthy people are taxed and high levels of income are taxed. It doesn't have to be an incentive. People say, if you tax them, what will happen? They won't invest. I'm saying, okay, there is an argument about incentive. If you tax them, what will happen? Suppose they, what will they do? Will they eat the money? Tell me. They'll say, oh, they go somewhere else to invest. Well, would you let them go somewhere else to invest? Why can't you put in place regulations that commit investors to staying with the state for a specified period of time if they are benefiting from any kind of tax concession? So, this ease of business and making things easier for corporates to come in and depending almost entirely on corporate investments for economic development has not worked for you. What is the track record of the last 5 years of private investments coming here in a big way to various states? And even if they did come in some states, like say Tamil Nadu has been trying, what is the employment impact? So when you look at corporate investment and you seek to promote it, you must have a more holistic view. Something must be linked to employment, something must be linked to local food security and all of that. So, you had Tamil Nadu, you had a social justice model so-called, and you had Samsung.
That's right.
Where the workers had no rights. And then the union fought and got it. Despite the fact that there were political alliance between the left and the DMK government, the left said that is a separate issue. On this, workers have expressed their views. So, at least in Tamil Nadu, there is a reasonable settlement after some effort. But in general, to go to a larger issue, if you think of promoting investments as a reason for a certain set of taxation measures or for certain policies, same companies play differently in their home countries. I mean, Samsung plays the game differently in South Korea, it plays it differently here. So when you're dealing with global multinationals, you also have to be alert that they can game you, just as you think you're trying to game them. So I think it's important to have a more sober understanding of not overly high expectations of what a GST can do. But yes, GST has come to stay. I'm not saying GST must go away, but I'm saying this GST, there has to be a national conference with all the state governments participating and economists participation, going into restructuring the GST mechanism. So it becomes a little less unequal, a little less elitist, a little more pro-people and pro-states.
Which is exactly what the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman had said in an interview yesterday to Economic Times. She said there's a version 2.0 of GST is coming up and she's working on that. So, and
Well, I'll wait till I see it. I'd be very surprised if Nirmala Sitharaman opted for equity.
okay.
Hasn't been a track record so far, but yeah, I mean, why prejudge? Yes, if it
Prime
comes out
Prime Minister Modi talks about cooperative federalism, and you still think
And does what?
and you still think GST Council could be that particular platform to promote cooperative federalism.
Well,
with the
he's
states
been there for
bringing-
10 years.
States
He's
and
been-
center coming together.
Mr.
Because
Modi,
see, I understand you already talked about the states not really having a leverage over taxation and all that, but you still think the central government's point of view is, look, we are bringing a consensus. Every single taxation
no,
on
no,
products
cooperative
being
federalism is a mantra Modi has been uttering. I agree. I know that he's been saying this. He's a master of mantras. But if you ask the question, how does cooperative federalism work out? When you have a policy I don't agree with, you have the National New Education Policy, Government of India. I don't agree with it, the state government. Then you tell me, oh, you don't agree with it, then you won't get any funding. That's cooperative federalism for you. So don't take the Prime Minister or the Finance Minister or me or anybody else at the rhetoric. Who are they biting and who are they eating? Ask the question. So if you take education, if you take healthcare, if you take state autonomy in many areas has been seriously countered and violated by the present union government dispensation for the last 10 years. Not that the previous regime was much better. I'm not saying Congress is a model of democratic center-state relations. It was not. But you see, I don't think it's the political party alone. I think as India becomes more and more integrated as an economy, and as corporates in India get bigger and bigger, and they have international partners, they tend to push uniform laws across much larger territories. So they will not have to reckon with local laws and all that. So, the drive for GST comes from that, the drive for uniformization of taxation comes from that. And it's not, why is uniformity always a good thing? I would prefer diversity.
Okay, so one last question there. If you were to rewrite the GST, today, and what's the single biggest flaw that you would sort of correct, and what's the most important reform that you think that we must be prioritizing right now?
Well, you see, that's a very good question you're asking, very fair question. That's why I said we should have a national conference to discuss various rival points of view. But I would try to restore some of the taxation powers of the states and not make them into mere dummies. Second, this is not to do with GST, the larger question of center-state financial relations. There, the finance commissions currently, direct the devolution of resources. I would say there should be a greater devolution of resources to the states from the present 41%, 59%, or 40%, 60%, because they made Kashmir into a union territory. You should have 50-50 at least, at a very minimum, given the much larger agenda of the state governments. So I'm mixing up two things. One, you asked me about GST. On that question, yes, it will be good to have a conference to elicit views from all the participants. I'm not here to give them a line on that, but certainly something that restores the powers of the states, that simplifies the mode of operation, and that still retains more than one tax rate, because we have to address questions of equity also, not just revenue alone. That's fine. And make ease of implementation for the poorer, smaller players, because for smaller players to maintain a an accountant and run an accounting system. I used to say this, in Chennai, if you're a grocery owner, you will certainly get about sales of about 1 lakh a month, maybe at least, you're a small guy. And then you have to employ an accountant, you have
That's
a
right.
laptop, there are overheads for these
Absolutely.
guys. So, there must be a raising in the ceiling of where you
You're talking
start
about ease
the
of
whole
compliance then, yeah.
Yes, and leave out the poor guys. I mean, we have to catch everybody. But they went to the extent of catching cattle traders also into this. This is the extreme version. So there are measures of this kind where you leave out exemption limits are set higher. Certain sections don't have to fill forms and keep being harassed by small bureaucrats in the local commercial tax offices. Some such tweaking has to be done, but I think all this is not going to come from an economist. It has come from collective political discussion of all these things. That's how I say it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. Pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.